buckets. Now, why would anybody go out here and spend, you know, $2 or $3 on a bucket when you can make your own? I'm with you. Yeah, make our own. Here's what got this going. A friend of mine, Elmer, emailed me and asked me if I knew anything about making buckets. Not really. I never been to bucket making college. I never been to bucket making elementary school. And he went on saying that, you know, there wasn't much out there on the internet about making buckets. So I thought about it, and I know a little bit about it. And the old guys who made them, they were called a cooper. Now, one of the things that they did, they used metal bands to hold their buckets and their barrels together. There was no glue involved. And when the liquid was put in them, they swelled up, and the joints were so tight that they held water. And you can do that as well. So we set out to make some buckets. So I got to playing. And the first thing I found out was it's all, of course, obviously, it's all in the angles. But we wanted to bring it down a little bit and not make it some mathematical, complicated thing. Now, all the bucket is a culmination of straight pieces of wood on various angles to create a circle of sorts. Now, I did this little chart. And if you use a 30 degree, and these are called, the vertical pieces in the bucket's called a stave. Now, depending upon how much angle you put on it is as to how many pieces you use. An example, 6, which I thought was that is, I know what that is, a sexagon. 8, of course, is an octagon. You use a 22.5. If you want 12 sides, 15 degrees. Now, all of this is maybe a little confusing at the moment, but you'll understand it. If you use 16 sides, it's 11.25 degrees. Then one I'm not sure really out there, but we kind of come up with was 32 staves and 5 5/8 degrees. And you're sitting there saying, 5 5/8 degrees, where did this idiot come up with that? Like I said, we come up with it, and we're going to show you how. So don't worry about that. The 2 with the asterisk, the 16 and the 32, proved out to be the best for making buckets. And the reason for that is we want them nice and round. Now I'm going to show you this. The first angle we're talking about is the angle right here on the staves where they come together. Now this one, this is 11.25 degrees. So is this one. Now here's that 5 5/8 degree. There's 16 staves in this one, there's 16 in this one, there's 32 in this one. Now what you notice very quickly is that this one has much less of a faceted, which is, look. This has a lot more rounder look. Now this one is also 32. The only difference between this one and this one is simply the height. But I wanted to show you just how height averages out. Then we have another angle, and that's the angle we taper the stave on. This is like a 15-degree angle, but we're going to show you different. This one I think is about a 5.5. This is about, this one's a little bit more than 5.5. And not that this matters, because we're not going to figure it out in that kind of terminology. Get this thing where I can read it. This is a 6.7. Now I'll show you how I figured them out. And this one is a 5.5, as well as is this one. And this one, this one's 16.5. But you can definitely see the difference in the appearance. This one looks like a planter. Unless you turn it upside down, then it kind of looks like a lampshade. So now you know how to make lampshades. Okay. Here's the deal. This one probably has the closest to a bucketed look. I like these a lot. Now there's 32 staves. And that sounds like an awful lot, but when you see this, you can go through them pretty quick. Now, the easy way to figure this out is in this bucket. This bucket is 14 inches across. Each stave measures 2 3/4 at the top, 2 1/4 at the bottom. This is also 2 3/4, but the bottom on this is an inch. Is an inch and 5/8. So 2 3/4 to 2 1/4, 2 3/4 to 1 5/8. Now this one, each stave in this one, now this is a 16-inch bucket. Each stave in this one is an inch. This is an inch and a half going down to an inch and 3/8. So very little reduction. And that gives, I like the slight taper. I like this one too. Anyway, now, like I said, now this one is exactly the same size, except it's a little taller. No difference. All right. So what we wind up with is a compound miter, but it's not difficult at all. And there's several ways to do it. Now, on this one, you'll notice we've got the elevated pieces for a handle. And we bent some handles that we'll be attaching. One of the things you want to do when if you make a handle to go on is make sure your handle will fold down enough to clear your bucket, so you have full access. Here's another one that we're going to put a handle on, and it allows it to fold down. Now these are laminate bent, and if you don't know what that is, that's where we took thin strips. This is 5 pieces to make up a 1/2 inch handle, because this is a steep radius. This is a 3/4 inch handle, top to bottom. And because this radius right here is so steep, this one has 10. Okay? So the thinner, just to understand, if you're making a radius bend, that tight of radius, and you want to, laminate bend a handle, you want the thinner the strips, the better it's going to bend. It's that simple. Then the only thing we did to make the handle was made up a jig, covered it with some duct tape so that we wouldn't glue to the jig, and clamped them in. Now, one thing I will tell you, when you're laminate bending something, when you make your pattern, you have to remove from the pattern whatever thickness you're going to be bending. You can't just bandsaw a line and bring the two together. That doesn't mate up and give you a good clamp. You have to remove whatever this thickness is going to be. That's what gives you a nice tight glue seams. Okay? So now we see a little bit the difference in the buckets. Kind of a neat way to make a handle. Now the other thing, if you make a handle, because of the angle, you're going to have to put a little wedge or something on it to keep your handle working, pivoting straight. Now to figure out that angle very quickly here, once you've got, you notice there's a lot of tape on here, and you'll see that in a minute. These aren't fully together because I want to show them to you. Simply, once you got it together, simply set you up a square. I'm showing you the other thing. Set you up a square against the side of your bucket. Take your piece of wood, set it in against the bucket, one of the flat sides, and draw it. That's how hard, and then bandsaw it out. That's how hard it is to figure out your angle for your wedges. Nothing to it. Okay. Let's go over here and I'm going to show you the jigs I came up with for making the staves and how we did it and how to lay it out. All right, before I do this other thing, I'm just to appease your curiosity is why you see all the tape on the buckets. Now, if you want it, and also to show you, if you just want to do a straight side, all you got to do is cut it at the angle, stack them, lay them together. Some good tape across them. Just like we did the miter. Flip it over. If you're going to glue it, flip it over. Run you some glue down each one of those V's. And then take and make your bucket. The tape will act as your clamp. Use a good tape. Duct tape works pretty good because you want to, keep it tight. And it does a really nice job of clamping it up. Okay, let's get to designing the bucket. Now, follow me close here, guys. Depending upon what diameter you want the top to be, simply take a square piece of wood, draw the circle for the size you want the outside of the top to be. Then, depending upon how thick your staves are. Now, to understand that, here's one at a 1/2 inch out of pine. This cherry one is 5/8, as well as the maple one over there. I think the poplar one's 3/4. The 3/4 is a little bit heavy. Okay, here's what you do. Draw your circle again. Then depending upon the thickness that you want, go from your outside edge and mark it. Then back to your center point with your compass. Mark it. Then the amount of taper. This is where you're going to establish it. Now that's why I told you we're going to do this a little different than all of those angles. On the one we have laid out here, if you measure from the edge of one, let me do it over here, it's easier. If you do it from the edge of one of these facets, right here, that's an inch, this is an inch and an eighth. That's what it amounts to, and that's what gives this taper. Anyway, here's what you do. If you look right here, forget this cutout. This is my outer perimeter. This is where the top of my stave is going to be. From this point to this point, yep, is an inch and an eighth. So I'm measuring from inside point, the inside right here, to what will be the inside of my bottom. Then I simply take my compass and I make my mark. Once I've done that, now I take a quarter of my circle, 1/4, and I bandsawed it out. Now what I'm going to show you is how you get that 5 5/8 angle. Then what I did was, knowing that if I've got 4 quadrants and I want 32 staves, I have to divide this into 8 separate sections. I measure it, 1/4 of it, divide it into 8 sections. So 13 divided by 8 is whatever it is. I think on this other one that's not here, it come up to be about 1 inch and 3/8, something like that. Got it. Divide it into how wide into equal segments. Then simply take a straight edge and go from your point to your center point. Draw your line. Slice the pie. That's all you got to do. Draw your line. Draw your line. This angle is going to be that 5 5/8 or whatever it's close to. Set your saw to a little bit over 5 1/2. Cut you a couple, scrap pieces until you're fitting this angle. Once you've got that, you're good. It's exactly what this equates to. When I had this fitting that angle on both sides, I'm good. So you may have to, make a couple of test cuts. Or if you're smart enough to be able to calculate and figure it all out and set your saw up at 5 5/8 or angle, then so be it. So as long as you use pretty much an even number of staves, you can establish at any angle you want. But the thinner, narrower staves, like I said, gave the best look. It gave the rounded look. Okay, let's go now look at how we cut those. Once you've established your width of your stave and you've established your angle, again, just to refresh, just make sure it's mating up with the angle. Now here's a hint. When you're ripping your staves, 2 things. One, always rip them on the angle. Keep your angles down, always down. In other words, this is going to be your wide side, the bottom will be your narrow side. Always cut them a little bit wide, 1/16, 1/8 of an inch. And I'll show you why just in a minute. Once you've got the width and you've got it ripped, then measure the width of what will be your inside bottom. Now on this one, I think it's 1 5/8, and this is 1 1/4. Find the center of what is going to be your stave. Once you've done that, then with your bottom measurement here at 1.25 inches, half of that is 5/8. Measure over. Then, taking your sample that has the angle on it, just simply flush it up, draw your angle. Same thing over here. Okay, now let's look at the jig. All I did was I took, there's 2 jigs. One cuts the first side of the taper. The other one will cut the other side. Here's what I did. All I did was very similar to what we used when I ran my jig, just a little piece of plywood. I just simply, against the fence, ran it through and cut it on the angle. And the reason I wanted that is I wanted to work in a zero clearance atmosphere. I wanted the edge of this saw blade to be the edge at that jig. Then all I had to do was take this. Now this piece is a little wider than what I used, and I probably got that off, but I'm going to show you this. What I did was, my first cut, I was cutting the taper from this end. This would be my narrow end, the wide end. And I simply set this flush with the edge of the jig, right here. Then I moved this out to match the line that I just drew. It's like this. This is flush. This moves out to the line right on the edge of the plywood. Once I did that, then what I did was I came back. You notice I have a stop block right here. Then I came back and I attached a piece of wood to hold me in alignment. Then I made my first cut. Now, to be sure you're accurate and that you get a full taper, here was a trick. I backed off on this one. I backed off of the blade a little bit, about a 1/16 between the blade and the jig. That way, when I ran it, I got the correct taper, but I still left some extra meat on this side, just so that in my second cut, I made sure that I got what I wanted. Now, and again, depending upon the size of the bucket, if you're using this 32 staves in it, you can get pretty narrow. So a toggle clamp was a good idea. Keep your fingers out of there. Now, the second jig is identical, except it's in reverse. Once I've cut this side, in order for me to cut the other, I have to reverse it. So all I did was set it up where this is the wide end, where on the first cut, this was the narrow end. Now this second cut, this is the wide end, this is the narrow end. Same exact setup. Put my piece of wood, except this time I came in to the edge of my fence, so that when I come down, I make my cut and I have my stave. All right, it was that difficult. It's no harder than that. Now, if you look at the cherry bucket, You see this long piece? Now we'll use that to attach a handle. But it also will help us a little bit more do another thing. So to have a couple of the staves, or one of them, longer than the other, that's a good thing. Now, here's something you want to do. If you want one longer, make sure that this piece of wood is not longer than what will be your normal stave. In other words, you don't want that piece being longer than this side. The reason for that is, if you don't, when you put your longer one in, it's not going to allow it to radius out enough that you get a full cut. So don't make this piece any longer than what will be your side. Don't have it extending way out on either one. Now, the reason that we want it at least one longer is to keep things as simple as we can. Now, you can do all the calculations you want, but if you've got one extending up just a little bit higher, okay, if you want to trim this top, angle this top back so that the top and the bottom sits dead flush, straight across, because at the moment they've got a little angle to them. Now you can really see that in one that's this exaggerated. You see how this is angled? So to get this, so to figure out your angle for coming straight across, if you make one just a little bit higher, all you have to do is simply lay a straight edge across the bucket, draw it. Now you know exactly what angle to cut it at when you go to your table saw. And we'll look at that. All right, guys, once you have your angle, that's going to give your top pieces dead flat. Now usually you're going to find it's pretty close to whatever degree you were doing your staves on. But because it's now on a taper, you're going to have to change this in order for it to do what you want. Now, you have to change your miter slide. The way to do that, for me, was just to simply set this up until it was square against my fence, move my miter slide until it was nice and square, where I was running true to the fence. Then setting up my stop and doing a little test to make sure that I was right. Now I want to show you this. In order for you to do it, to cut the top, you want the staves with the inside up. That's on a left tilt. If you're on a right tilt, it would be down. So pay attention to that, the tilt being the blade. Then just cut them. Yours may vary a little bit, but it's pretty close with what I had. Just get your angle right. Now, to cut the bottom, if you look at the way this stands, we've got to take the majority off on the inside of the top, which is what we did. On the bottom, because of the way it stands, we got to take it off on the outside. So we have to do the same thing, except we have to change our slide. Fitting up tight, close enough. Then I simply go through here, and I want my cut to come in right here on the bottom, and it's just going to cut that little teeny angle. Now, because we have a faceted, no matter what we do, we don't have a perfect round. It doesn't matter. For our bottom, we have to cut a groove. So setting with our inside down on this, you can either do multiple cuts or take a dado blade and set it up, just do it equal. Cut it to whatever depth and whatever width you want. Now, we're going to go to the router table, and I'm going to show you another way of cutting this groove and another way of making a bucket. On most of the buckets, except for the 1/2 inch one, I cheated. I took a wing cutter and put a larger bearing on it so that I had a 3/8 of an inch depth. With my bucket all together or taped up, I set over top of the bit and I went right around it. In doing so, I cut my groove in my bottom, no issue. The other thing I did, using the same bit, was I lowered it and whatever I made because this had cut a specific depth, what I was able to do was use a little thicker bottom. I ran around my bottom to cut a thicker bottom to the thickness I wanted to fit in my groove. But if you do, if you're doing one of these 16-inch buckets, to put a 3/8 bottom in it, or a regular bucket, put a 1/4 inch bottom in it, you're doing fine. Now I'll tell you, all my bottoms are solid. Put a plywood bottom in it, wouldn't hurt a thing. That's the way I did that. Now we're going to look at another way of making buckets. Here's another way. Now, this is with a router bit. And I'm going to show it to you in a minute. And this is just all too cool. Here's what happens. The bit is called a Canoe Bit. And what it does is one part of it cuts a radius, a bull nose. The other part will cut a matching cove. Now the one I've got's 3/8, and I think they go up to 1/2 or maybe even larger. But here's what it creates. It creates a hinge. Now, the cool thing about these is you can make, just again, depending upon the width of the stave. Now this is a straight bucket. That's actually, a small one would be like a lunch pail, and a large one, these were typically berry buckets or picking buckets, and the sides were straight. They were not angled. But the cool thing about this is, and all I got on is a piece of duct tape, but you can make buckets or containers of about any size or shape, because this thing will flex so much that it's hinging in there. You want to make an oval, doesn't matter. You can just get as creative with this as you want. Now here's the thing, because what you want to do, because it'll flex in so many different directions, a smart way to do this is to draw you a circle for the size you want. Again, divide it out into how many staves you want. Then cut it for the interior so that you have something to form this around. Because it will go, and if you can, form a bottom, 2 pieces, so that you have something to form this around, because it will go in any direction you want. I mean, you can get really weird with this thing. I mean, it'll flex anywhere you want. So, to have your shape cut out so that you have something to work to would be pretty cool. If I were doing it, I would make my staves longer. I would have a sacrificial bottom and a sacrificial top. And I would simply, as I went around, just kind of pin nail it or something to hold my shape and my form till my glue dried. But let's look at how we made them. The first thing is you're obviously going to be using typically narrow material. That's dangerous. We have a featherboard set up. Now be careful with your featherboard on this bit, because you get too far up here, you can hit your featherboard. And I have it set up on a fence. A simple slide, just like this right here. I'll show it to you. Pretty self-explanatory. And all this is a stop, this is a little hold down, and it goes up against it, and I'm able to run it and keep my hands out of the way. Let's look at a bit. Again, it's called a Canoe Bit. Now the one I'm using came from Price Cutter. And Price Cutter's number on it, this is a 3/16 radius, is a P14 3425. But you'll see them out there other places. And if you look at it, this is your cove right here. Then right here, excuse me, this is your radius. And then this is your cove, whatever you call it. You got a convex and a concave cutter. Now to do this, what you want to do is you'll notice that there's a shoulder. You will notice there's a shoulder right here. What you want is you want just the radius. And like I said, they come in different sizes. So when I ran this is cutting right here. Takes you just a second to get your up and down, but it's not difficult at all. Then this one, of course, cuts the radius. And again, it forms the hinge. You know, people like to make steamer trunks and things like that. They were coopered as well. Okay, let's go look at how to get our bottom ready to go in. All right, guys, another way of cutting your angles is router bit. You can buy just about every angle out there except for that 5 5/8 thing. You know, you can even get the 11 1/4 bit. And that's just all too easy. You know, when you set your bit up, just make sure of one thing. You don't have it act as a joiner. You want it to cut to the top edge, but not, again, to act as a joiner and take it off both sides. This ensures, you know, a router is going to ensure you a perfect stave every time. Router's going to ensure you just perfect joints, really nice tight lines every single time. You know, you can simply go to your table saw and instead of doing the angle on the side, just simply cut your staves to the vertical angle that you want, come back to your router bit, run them, and no issues. It just absolutely makes for a great way to make a bucket or any radius. You know, we talked about like a steamer trunk lid or anything you want, you know, or a radius panel door. You know, you just keep on walking around. Radius, you know, angled router bits, they just do a nice job too. Remember our pattern? We're looking at our bottom now. Remember the pattern. We had established on the pattern the inside of our bottom, of the very bottom of the bucket. So what I did was I took my compass and all I did was made sure that I was on that. Then what I did was I took what's going to be my bottom and I drew it. Now what all this is going to do is give us a reference to make sure that our bucket is pretty close to round. Then, by placing my bucket on it, I can look through the inside and make sure that I'm nicely spaced around, and that gives my bucket, I'm looking to make sure that, you know, I'm as round as I can get it. Now once I have it looking pretty good, that looks pretty good right there. Then, because it's faceted, I'm going to go through and I'm going to draw it. All right, that done. What I wind up with, now this is the actual inside of my bucket, and you can see every little facet on it. Now, in the case of the 32 stave buckets, I probably wouldn't have, I could probably just come out here and cut it round and be okay. In the case of the ones that I made at 11 1/4 degrees, where my facets are a lot heavier, what I did was I laid it out and I cut each one of the facets. Now, but it was a little bit more involved. I'm going to show that to you. Oh yeah, to put this thing in, that was fun. I got to tell y'all guys, I had fun making these. All right. There we go. Now, this line is the actual inside of the bucket. Now, depending upon the depth that you cut the slot to receive the bottom, you have to increase this by that amount. All right, on this one, because the bottom of the bucket, my slot that was going to receive the bottom was 1/4 inch deep, I cut me a little 1/4 inch shim. Now, all I did was lay it on each facet and draw it. And I just walked around my template. On this one, where it's 3/8 of an inch, it's exactly the same thing. Now the last thing, the angle that we used to cut the dado, the same angle. Simply set your bandsaw to that angle, because if you notice in our bucket, because of the angle, the bottom is just a little bit wider or longer, if you will, than the top. That's typical of an angle. Depends upon how particular you want to get. And simply set your bandsaw, okay, on an angle, cut it out. All right? Now you got to cut it reverse. You understand that, because I don't know about your bandsaw, but mine angles like this. So that when I fit in pretty close, pretty nice and tight. Now, like I said, whether you elect to glue yours up or band it. Now we're going to talk about banding it a minute. I told you in the beginning that the old timers, they weren't glued. They were simply driven together using metal bands. That can be tough. Now, most of the Coopers had blacksmiths or their own blacksmith facility. Now, here's the, if you're going to make a band, in my case, I made it out of copper. But copper makes a good band. Doesn't rust, and easy to work with. It's very malleable, and it's also, well, it's not super easy to come by, but what you use is actually copper roofing flashing. So you can check with some of your high-end or metal roofers around, or gutters, guys who make the copper gutters, because all it is just a very thin, about a 32nd of an inch thick, it's copper roof flashing. Now, if you don't want to go the copper route, you can also go with like an aluminum flashing, or you can try to find another metal. All right, let's talk about this banding thing. I told you that in the banding, that's what the old timers did, and they didn't use glue. And I told you I used the copper. Now the reason I used the copper is I had it. I got to try something. So here's what I did. I simply took and I braided the back of that copper really well. Means I just took a really rough sandpaper and sanded it. And I glued it with some 5-minute epoxy. And it feels good. I mean, it's tight. Now, I don't know that it would be a permanent bond, so I would be sure and nail it a little bit and tack it. If you use aluminum flashing, again, you have to abrade it. You got to give that epoxy a tooth, something to bite into. Aluminum will not hold for a super long time. The reason is aluminum oxidizes on its own, as well as copper. Copper just tarnishes. Aluminum will actually oxidize and it forms a coating on it. And that coating would cause the epoxy, I would think, to not hold. So if you use aluminum, again, you want to nail it. Now, the biggest thing with your bands is how to make them, if you want. When you have your piece glued up, or excuse me, rather, taped up, and you lay it out, okay? This just gave you the perfect, you've got to cut it on this arc for the bottom, this arc for the top, for it to go around a circle. Now, if you've got a straight-sided bucket, no. It's just a straight shot. But if you've got the angle, you've got to be able to make the arc. That's what will allow it to fold around and set flat on the sides. Otherwise, it's going to try to stick out at the bottom. And I'm not getting heavy duty into the banding because I would dare to say most of you are going to glue it. That brings up another point. When you glue your bucket, have your bottom ready to go in. Take the bottom of your bucket, the edge, put you some tape around there so that it will not bond when you glue it. To round your bucket further, glue your bucket up in 2 halves. Leave it in, glue it up, leave 2 halves. Then the bucket can come apart and the bottom come out. At that point, you're going to have this arc sitting here that you have total access to on the inside. You can then get in there with a spoke shave, scrapers, and you can smooth it up if you want. At the same point in time, you can get to the outside of it and you can come through with a little hand plane and remove the facets on it. And you can create your bucket perfectly round. If what I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to glue mine a little bit just because it makes sense. I realize they didn't, but I'm not out to compete with, I don't have the blacksmith capability. And the reason I say that's an issue, now these I soldered, and this is the one I played with, and I don't know if you can see on camera the angle this sits on, but the angle has to match the bucket. Now it will go around the facets because copper is so malleable. But what you're going to wind up doing when you put it on, now the way I'm going to do it is I'm actually going to take this, then I'm going to take me some copper tacks if I can find them. I got some today, but the problem with it was they were copper plated, and that wasn't what I wanted. If I can, I'm going to get me some little small brass nails, and once I've got this, now once you start getting it on pretty snug, then you just simply take a little block of wood and start tapping it up to where it's even. And it's good and tight. As you go around, because the copper is malleable, you're going to see it dent a little bit. Take you a mallet, take you a hammer, and you can bend it perfectly to fit your facets. Makes it cool. The aluminum will do the same thing. If you wanted to do one out of wood, sure, you can do that. But you're going to have to take it, and what you're going to have to do is to take a piece of nice straight grain material, whatever you choose to use, and you're going to have to bend it. You're going to have to steam it and bend it. A lot of the old timers would use green wood. They would actually go out and split out a sapling or something and spoke shave it, and the reason they split it is that kept that grain going all in the same direction. Then they would wrap it around there as tight as they could get it. Now what happened was two things. They wanted the bucket made out of as dry materials they could get, and they wanted the bands out of as green a material as they could get. Then two things happened. When they put water in it, the outside, the bucket itself expanded because it absorbed moisture. The other thing was, being on the outside, the green wood shrunk. So as the band tightened and as the interior expanded, the bucket just got tighter. And that's why you see an old bucket that's band, they didn't nail them or nothing. The reason the old buckets, the bands would finally eventually fall off was that the bucket itself would dry out over a period of time, and when it did, the bands were loose. So they would have to drive the bands down a little further. Now what I did, once I had my band cut, I wrapped it around and found my center point, right where I want it. And I just simply took it and just slid it in a little bit. Now on this one, I don't know if you guys know, this is kind of gnarly looking because I haven't finished it. I cut a little, what's called a swallowtail, or just a little funny looking tail on it. And if you get out there and look around and you're doing the wood, you'll see the one to where you actually take and make a split in it. Then there's an arrow, kind of an arrowhead shape made on it, and you twist it in the wood and it goes up through the slot, you twist it back, and it makes an interlock. Pretty cool. Now the last thing I'm going to tell you about is the handles. I showed you and told you about bending them, told you about putting the wedges on so that they operate nicely. Then in between, put you a washer. Then what I'm going to do is I made me some wood knobs with dowels. And we have a clip showing you how we got these in and straight. I'm simply going to drill it. This will get sanded and I'll shape it a little bit, make it kind of pretty, as well as this. I'm going to drill it, put it through. The washer again would go in between here to make it function well. I'm going to put it through there where it comes out on the other side because I want a wooden bucket. Then I'm going to drill me a hole, an 1/8 inch hole through this. And I'm going to glue me an 1/8 inch dowel. That'll keep it from pulling out. And my handle will work. Now I'll probably put a washer on the inside as well, just for fun. That's how my experience and how I make my newfound profession of bucket making. So boys, make you a bucket. I met some of you fellas, you could feel it too. I got news for you. Later, guys. Now the last thing I'm going to tell you about is the handles. I showed you and told you about bending them, told you about putting the wedges on so that they operate nicely. Then in between, put you a washer. Then what I'm going to do is I made me some wood knobs with dowels. And we have a clip showing you how we got these in and straight. I'm simply going to drill it. This will get sanded and I'll shape it a little bit, make it kind of pretty, as well as this. I'm going to drill it, put it through. The washer again would go in between here to make it function well. I'm going to put it through there where it comes out on the other side because I want a wooden bucket. Then I'm going to drill me a hole, an 1/8 inch hole through this. And I'm going to glue me an 1/8 inch dowel. That'll keep it from pulling out. And my handle will work. Now I'll probably put a washer on the inside as well, just for fun. All right guys, if y'all want to make a little handle like we did, the little knob, well, all I did was took a wooden knob, nothing fancy. Now this one happens to have a hole in it. If you're going to drill it with a drill by hand, fill the hole. Otherwise, your brad point is going to go all over the place. Set your knob so as straight as you can get it, and just clamp it in. Now I'm going to go to the drill press, drill the hole. All right, one hole about 3/8 of an inch deep, 3/8 dowel, glue it. Now odds are you're going to have just a little wiggle or movement in this. So to keep it nice and straight, once you've glued it, take a sacrificial piece of wood that's a little bit thick, glue it, push it in, and drill this on the drill press. As long as this is straight, then this will, and then you bring your knob up tight when the glue. Then once you've done that, just kind of ease it out so you don't glue it to the board. When it's dry, you now have a knob with the dowel that's going to work pretty straight. All right, guys, I was about to forget something on these handles, okay? There's a surefire way of putting a handle on a bucket, and it guarantees it will fit each and every hand. It's called 2 holes, a rope, and 2 knots. And you got a bucket handle. Pretty popular, been around for a long time. Just a good old-fashioned rope knot handle. I'm going to use it. I like it. You know, if you want to get fancy, you can actually drill like an inch or 1.25 dowel. Run this up through it. You tie a knot on one side of the dowel. You tie a knot on the other side so it can't move and it stays in the middle. Rope handles. That's how my experience and how I make my newfound profession of bucket making. So boys, make you a bucket. Just in case you decide to band it and you decide to use copper, just to be thorough, I'm going to show you how to solder copper real quick. What you want is your mating surfaces to be very, very clean. A little sanding does the trick. Then, if you're going to do like a little decorative end where you're going to come together, what you want to do is you just want the very back right here to overlap. That's going to be your joint. Otherwise, you're going to get solder going to be bleeding all around here. Kind of look like a mess. Clamp it together with something that won't burn. Now you need a butane torch. Now the solder, there's 2 choices. One is called an acid core solder that already has an acid in it that's used to etch metal. That means it super cleans it for the solder to adhere. Otherwise, if you buy a solid core solder, you have to buy a flux. The flux is a paste that you put on, and when it gets hot, it creates the acid instead of the acid core. Simply get the copper hot enough that it'll melt, and it doesn't take much, that it'll melt the solder. You want the solder to do what's called sweat in. There you go. See how it just sweats right up in there? It's the exact same way you solder a water pipe. Now, if you could take this apart, you can see out here that solder literally sucks in underneath there and creates you a really, really strong joint. And by doing it, you have a nice looking surface. Again, the nice thing about solder and copper is they're both soft, so they're malleable. Means they're easy to work. If you get a little solder on it that you don't want, take a file or a little sandpaper and clean it right off, and you're done. Nothing to it. This has got a lump in it, a little sanding. It's got